Hey guys, welcome back. Happy November 5th. Happy Bonfire Night, guys. I hope you guys have some great plans to celebrate and enjoy some fireworks and enjoy a bonfire. I've got a video here from Sean, one of the subscribers that he sent me. This is from dear old Britain, and it is 15 forgotten bonfire night recipes your nan probably made. Pretty excited for this one. It's a little long. It's about 20 minutes. Not too bad. But yeah, I'm excited to see this. As usual, I will link this video in the description if you guys want to check it out yourself or check out some of Dear Old Britain's other videos. I will also put a link in there for Patreon. If you want to see some full episode and full movie reacts, pretty much all British stuff right now. But always open to your all suggestions. And then we'll also have a link in the description if you want to support the channel here on YouTube and get some extra perks. But yeah, let's go ahead and get this going. I'm excited to see it.
There was a time when November 5th meant more than just fireworks lighting up the sky. For working-class families across Britain in the 1950s through the 1970s, Bonfire Night was as much about the food as it was about the fire. Whole communities gathered around smoky piles of timber, waiting for sparks to rise into the cold air while their hands clutched whatever warming treat Nan had pulled from her kitchen. These recipes didn't need to be written down. They were passed by habit and memory, tied to a night that came once a year but lived forever in the senses. Today, many of them have vanished from British tables, replaced by supermarket multipacks and organized displays where food is bought, not made. But if you grew up in those decades, you'll remember the smells, the tastes, and the simple rituals that once defined Guy Fawkes Night. The king of them all was Bonfire Toffee. Known as plot toffee, claggum, or treacle toffee, it was a slab of black, rock-hard sugar that could crack a tooth as easily as it cracked in your hand. Nans boiled down treacle, golden syrup, and sugar until the whole kitchen filled with a smell both bitter and sweet. Children leaned close to the pan, watching as the bubbling mass reached the hard crack stage before being poured into trays to cool. The real fun came after, wrapping the toffee in a tea towel and smashing it with a hammer so shards flew across the table with a noise as sharp as fireworks. Dentists dreaded November because it left a trail of broken fillings and aching jaws, but for kids it was a badge of honor to gnaw on a jagged piece until it stuck to their teeth. In Yorkshire and Lancashire, it was as much a part of Bonfire Night as the flames themselves. Food historians note that recipes for bonfire toffee appeared in regional cookbooks by the early 20th century, and by the 1950s it was still a favorite in working-class homes, costing pennies for the sugar and treacle needed to make a tray large enough for the whole street. Pockets rattled with shards, coats reeked of smoke, and children went to bed that night with sticky fingers they could never quite lick clean. If the toffee was a
I don't think I've ever had toffee like that. My grandmother, and you could get it other places too. It used to be like a rock candy that you would break apart just like that. It'd be in like shards. Usually, what my nana would make was the cinnamon version, which was my favorite. And then it'd have like a little bit of powdered dust sugar on it too. But you could also find it in like a mint flavor, and both were super, super good. But the cinnamon was where it was at. But uh, I've never had like toffee. You guys are much bigger on toffee than we are. You just don't see stuff flavored with with toffee. I think we have maybe one candy bar that has toffee. I think it's a Heath bar. My mom likes it. Um, but that's pretty much it. Like we certainly don't have this typically around. Um, so I don't know why it didn't transfer over here, but Yeah, I like the cinnamon.
Was about crunch. Parkin was about chew. This sticky oat and treacle cake, particularly tied to Yorkshire, was baked ahead of time so it could rest and grow denser with every day. Families swore it tasted best 2 or 3 days after coming out of the oven, when the treacle had soaked deep into the oats and ginger. On November 5th, slabs were cut thick and handed out in greasy fingers, warming bodies against the night air. The National Food Survey for 1953 lists treacle, golden syrup and oats among the most affordable ingredients, with oats costing under 4 pence per pound. A pan of Parkin could be made for under 2 shillings, feeding a family of 6 with leftovers to spare. Oral histories from Yorkshire mining towns describe mothers baking Parkin in battered enamel tins, wrapping it in greaseproof paper and tucking it into children's coat pockets to eat while collecting wood for the bonfire. The smell of ginger and treacle became as much a part of bonfire night as the acrid smoke rising from the fire.
Never heard of treacle before. This looks really good to me because I love like gingerbread stuff. My grandmother and I, when she lived with us, I would always get her and I like a bag of ginger snaps. Um, and I remember her, she used to make like a lot of different kinds of bread. She'd make, usually it was banana bread, but she would also do zucchini bread sometimes and just different ones. But they also do like a gingerbread loaf as well, and it's delicious, especially with some nice hot butter on it. But yeah, I love the flavor of ginger. I think this one looks super good.
A scent that lingered in scarves and gloves until the next morning. No November 5th felt complete without jacket potatoes cooked in the embers. Long before foil-wrapped spuds became a festival cliché, they were the simplest and most satisfying way to feed a crowd around a bonfire. Potatoes were cheap, averaging 3 to 4 pence per pound in the 1950s, and every household had a sack in the pantry, wrapped in foil or in earlier days just thrown in as they were. The potatoes roasted slowly in the hot ash while fireworks cracked overhead. The skins emerged blackened, sometimes split, with steam hissing the moment a knife cut into them. Butter, salt, and sometimes just a splash of vinegar turned them into feasts that burned eager tongues but warmed cold hands. Surveys in northern counties during the 1960s recorded potatoes still making up nearly 40% of household food weight, proof of how central they were to everyday meals. On bonfire night, they took on a special role, dug out of the fire with sticks while children cheered as if they were treasure. For many, the hiss of foil and the first bite of smoky potato flesh was the sound and taste of November. For those in Lancashire, bonfire night meant something more unusual: black peas, also known as parched peas, sold steaming in paper cups at fairgrounds and village greens. These were dried maple peas simmered for hours until soft and served with nothing more than salt and vinegar. They cost next to nothing. Dried peas were around 3 pence per pound and provided earthy, filling warmth on cold evenings. Regional reports note that in Preston, Bolton and Wigan, black peas were as synonymous with November 5th as the fire itself, with whole stalls dedicated to ladling them out. Local councils once debated banning the stalls on hygiene grounds, but public protests forced them to stay, proving how central the peas were to tradition. Oral histories recall miners and mill workers finishing shifts and heading straight to the bonfire for a cup of peas, eaten with wooden forks or even just fingers. The smell was distinctive, slightly nutty, slightly sour with vinegar, and for many older Lancashire families, no bonfire night felt right without it. In the Black Country, it was something heavier: Groaty pudding. Known locally as Groaty Dick, this was a slow-cooked dish of groats, hulled oats, beef, onions and leeks, baked for up to 16 hours until it turned into a dense, dark mass. It wasn't pretty, and even back then it divided opinion. But for those who grew up around Dudley or Wolverhampton, it was bonfire night tradition. Local butchers sold special Groaty mixes in the run-up to November 5th, and families would prepare their pudding the night before, sliding it into the oven and letting it cook low and slow until the fire was lit outside. Food historians trace Groaty pudding's link to Guy Fawkes' Night back to the 19th century, with recipes published in regional papers by the 1850s. By the 1950s and 60s, it was still a fixture in working-class kitchens across the Midlands, costing under a shilling per pound of oats and beef combined. One 1962 survey of black country households found nearly half still making it for November 5th, despite younger generations turning their noses up. Its rich, savory flavour filled kitchens with an aroma that mingled with the bonfire smoke drifting in through the cracks in terrace house doors. For children, it wasn't always welcome, but for their parents, it was tradition. Heavy food for a heavy night. If Bonfire, Toffee and Parkin were the sweets that defined the night, there were other dishes that filled stomachs before the fireworks had even begun. They weren't fancy, and few would appear on restaurant menus today, but in the 1950s through the 70s, they were centerpieces of November evenings across Britain. Some were regional staples, others were simple household recipes passed by word of mouth, but all of them carried the unmistakable taste of bonfire night. In Yorkshire, nothing said November quite like a pork pie with mushy peas. While pork pies were eaten year-round, they had a special place on bonfire night tables. The dense pastry case, packed with seasoned pork and sealed with jelly, was easy to slice and serve outdoors, even in the freezing dark. Local butchers sold thousands in the week leading up to the 5th, often alongside vats of mushy peas that could be ladled into bowls. Oral histories from Leeds and Sheffield recall children balancing paper plates piled high with peas and pastry, while rockets screeched overhead and Catherine wheels squealed against garden fences. Pork cost a...
That's one thing that I'm like, how, like, these are like, it's not foods that I would think of. Obviously, I'm not, well, I'm British by blood, I guess, but I'm not British of having grown up there. I wasn't born there, never even been there. But these aren't foods that I would typically think of as like foods that you would eat outdoors. Like, I would think of things that would be easy to walk with and move around with, like like for us, like hot dogs, some handheld stuff. But but then I'm like, well, we have like chili fests and stuff like that where you walk around and you kind of put it in a styrofoam cup or something and walk around with it and eat it. All of these things look pretty good. I would definitely try it. The oats one and the meat is very interesting. I've never heard of anything like that. I might have to look up maybe a recipe for that, just to kind of get an idea of what the flavors are of that, because that's not something we have, not something I've ever heard of. Um, but like all of this to me looks really good, but I don't know how you would walk around and I guess you just sit down and eat it somewhere, right?
around 2 shillings per pound in the 1950s, but the pie stretched it further, feeding whole families for under 5 shillings. The National Food Survey recorded Yorkshire households consuming pork pies at nearly twice the rate of southern regions, proof of their cultural pull. To this day, older Yorkshire residents recall bonfire night not just for the fireworks, but for the sound of fireworks popping while steam rose from a plate of pie and peas eaten by firelight. If the pork pie was hearty, toffee apples were pure spectacle. Crisp apples skewered on sticks, dipped in molten sugar syrup, and hardened to a glass-like shell, they were as much decoration as they were dessert. Their glossy red coating caught the flicker of flames, making them irresistible to children even as parents winced at the thought of cracked teeth. By the late 1950s, a dozen apples could be bought for around a shilling, and sugar for pennies more, meaning they were cheap treats in a decade when budgets were tight. Hull Fair alone sold tens of thousands in the run-up to Bonfire Night, proof of their popularity. The crunch, as the sugar shell shattered, gave way to the sharp bite of apple, often loud enough to compete with the fireworks overhead. By the 1970s, mass-produced versions wrapped in cellophane had begun to appear, but the homemade kind, uneven, sticky, sometimes dripping down the stick, carried the stronger memory. For many, the taste of sugar and smoke together still marks the night more vividly than the fireworks themselves. For adults, the warmth came less from sugar and more from the mug in their hands. Mulled apple cider was a common feature of village gatherings, especially in the West Country and parts of the Midlands. Apples simmered with cloves, cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of rum turned into a drink that cut through the damp cold of November. Even those who didn't drink alcohol made mulled apple or spiced cordial for children, filling the night air with the scent of spice and citrus as the fire roared outside. Apples cost around 3p per pound in the 1950s, and cloves or spices were sold in small tins that lasted for weeks, making mulled cider both affordable and communal. Oral accounts describe whole barrels being heated at community bonfires, with ladles clanging against the rim as mugs were dipped in and passed around. Brewers even reported seasonal spikes in cider sales each November, tied directly to bonfire night gatherings. For those who grew up with it, the first sip still recalls the hiss of damp logs and the muffled thump of fireworks behind the clouds. Among the spiced treats, sticky ginger loaf held a quiet but important place. Sold in grocers and baked in countless home kitchens, this dense, dark loaf carried the same gingery heat as Parkin, but without the oats. It sliced neatly, travelled well, and kept for days in the pantry. Lyons sold packaged versions for under 2 shillings, but many families made their own with flour, treacle, ginger, and butter. Oral recollections from Midlands households describe nans slicing ginger loaf into thick slabs, spreading them with butter, and wrapping them in grease-proof paper to hand out at the bonfire. The taste was sweet and fiery, with just enough chew to keep children satisfied between fireworks. The Ministry of Food included ginger recipes in their wartime leaflets, encouraging families to use spice to lift otherwise plain meals, and the habit carried into the 60s and 70s. The smell of ginger and treacle mixed with the acrid smoke of sparklers is a sensory memory many never forgot, though few households still bake it today. For dessert beyond the sweets, treacle sponge pudding often made its way onto November tables. Steamed for hours in
You guys need to tell me what this treacle is because I've never even heard of it.
battered pudding basins, then drenched with golden syrup until it glistened, it was the kind of dish that made families linger in the kitchen long after the fire outside had burned low. The National Food Survey shows golden syrup consumption peaking in the 1950s at nearly £2 per person annually, much of it going into puddings like this. Treacle sponge cost less than 3 shillings to prepare, feeding 6 with ease, and appeared in Ministry of Food leaflets as a morale-boosting dessert in post-war Britain. Oral memories tie it directly to bonfire night in many households, served hot with custard before families wrapped up and headed into the cold. The contrast was powerful, warm sponge and custard in the belly, then the bite of November air on the face. Today, few restaurants would serve it, but for those who grew up with it, treacle sponge is inseparable from the crackle of fireworks and the smoke that clung to scarves for days after. As the night stretched on and the last of the fireworks fizzled, bonfire night often ended in kitchens rather than gardens. Families came in with cheeks red from the cold and clothes thick with the smell of smoke. What came next wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. These were the recipes that carried the night past the crack of rockets and into the quiet hours, filling stomachs with whatever Nan had managed to stretch from her pantry. One of the most familiar was bread pudding with raisins. For families that saved every scrap, stale bread was never wasted. It was soaked in milk, mixed with dried fruit, sprinkled with nutmeg, and baked until firm enough to cut into squares. At less than a penny per slice, it was one of the cheapest puddings of the 1950s. The Ministry of Food had promoted bread pudding during the war, even printing leaflets with the slogan, "Waste not, want not," and the habit carried on long after rationing ended. Oral accounts from Birmingham describe children sitting at the table after the fire, sparklers still hissing faintly outside, clutching warm slices in one hand and licking the sugary crust. The heavy sweetness kept hunger away, but not everyone welcomed it. Some remembered the dense texture as punishment rather than treat. Yet for others, the smell of raisins and nutmeg still brings back the crackle of November fires decades later. Another thrifty dish was hot potato cakes, made from yesterday's mash fried in dripping until golden. The pan hissed as the cakes hit the fat, sending up a smell as strong as the smoke still clinging to coats. Potatoes were the backbone of working-class diets. £4 per person each week on average in the early 1950s, and no scrap was wasted. By turning them into flat cakes, mothers could stretch a meal further and feed hungry children within minutes of coming indoors. Oral histories from Durham recall kids stamping their feet against the cold while waiting for the first batch to slide off the pan. Some ate them plain with just a pinch of salt, others dipped them in brown sauce that ran down their fingers. They were quick, cheap, and filling, but there was one drawback. They disappeared from the plate faster than they could be fried. For something with a little more bite.
Oh, these sound really good. We have bread pudding and raisins. I think my mama used to make it on occasion. I remember it being good. But it's certainly not something you see very often today. It was definitely something probably from the same time. Um, the potato cakes, I don't think I've ever had, but they look incredible. I love potatoes anyway.
There were always homemade sausage rolls. Long before supermarket packs, they were made with sausage meat and scraps of pastry, baked unevenly in home ovens. Pork sausages sold for just over 1 shilling per pound in the 1950s, and pastry cost almost nothing if made with lard and flour already on hand. Families baked trays in the afternoon, the smell of pastry filling the house long before the fire was lit. Oral recollections from the Midlands describe children clutching sausage rolls in paper napkins while fireworks screeched overhead. In some towns, church fetes sold hundreds in the run-up to November 5th, and village bonfires relied on trays carried in by volunteers. They weren't perfect, sometimes greasy, sometimes burnt, but that was part of the charm. By the late 1960s, frozen sausage rolls were appearing in shops, but older families still swore that nothing tasted like the flaky, irregular ones Nan pulled from her oven, even if they left greasy fingerprints on coats and mittens. One of the most evocative bonfire night foods was baked apples stuffed with sugar and raisins. Cored and filled with brown sugar, raisins, and sometimes cloves, they were wrapped in foil and tossed into the embers of the fire. Within minutes they split open with a faint hiss, juices running into the ash, skins blistering and blackened. Apples were cheap, around 3p a pound, and nearly every household had a basket of them. Welsh mining families recalled scooping molten apple flesh with spoons, burning their tongues because they couldn't wait. The smell, sweet fruit mixed with smoke and spice, was as much a part of the night as the fireworks. Yet the tradition carried risk. More than one child went to bed with a scalded mouth after rushing in too soon. Today, hardly anyone bothers to make them this way, but for those who grew up with it, the memory is inseparable from the fire itself. Finally, when the fire had burned down and the cold crept back in, some households turned to vegetable soups ladled into mugs. Thick pea, lentil, or root veg soups bubbled in big pots on stovetops, and sometimes even at the bonfire's edge. The Ministry of Food had long promoted them as economical meals, and they were easy to prepare with carrots at 4p a pound, swedes at 3, and turnips at 5. Oral histories from Lancashire recall queues of children shuffling forward, stamping their feet for warmth, as mugs of steaming soup were handed out. The ladle clanged against the enamel pots, steam mixing with the last smoke from damp wood. The taste was peppery, simple and sustaining, and for many families it was the final act of bonfire night. One more spoonful before bed, coats draped over chairs still smelling of smoke, and the night was done. These last dishes may not have carried the glamour of bonfire toffee or the spectacle of toffee apples, but they mattered just as much. They were proof that bonfire night wasn't only about fireworks. It lived in the kitchen, in Nan's hands, in the clatter of pans and the hiss of food pulled from the fire. For those who remember, it's impossible to think of November 5th without tasting smoke, sugar, spice, and the kind of food that kept you warm long after the fire went out.
Remember,
It was a good video. I appreciate that from Sean. Um, yeah, a lot of stuff, like I said, that I've never even heard of. Um, some stuff that kind of surprised me that was eaten during that event, but all of it looked really good and interesting. Um, yeah, looks great. You guys, it sounds like are in for a delicious meal tonight. So, again, you guys enjoy your bonfire night. I hope you get some of these delicious, delicious foods. That seems like an awesome tradition. Um, but yeah, guys, thank you for watching with me and sharing this tradition with me. And yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, share. Um, but yeah, have a great time tonight, guys.